I want to say welcome to everyone. I am in Johnson, Vermont, and representing the Vermont Studio Center, which is an artist residency in North Central Vermont. And I am excited to say we will be welcoming residents back to the Vermont Studio Center starting January 2nd, and we're very much looking forward to it. Yeah. So that's some happy news to share. The Vermont Studio Center is held on the traditional unsurrendered territory of the Abenaki people here in Vermont. It's one of the 5 Wabanaki nations who have continued and enduring presence in this land. And we acknowledge the Abenaki and Wabanaki ancestors, past and present and future. And now I'd just like to take a few minutes to introduce Leeza Meksin to you tonight. She's going to talk about her work and her past related to that. So I just would like to take a few minutes to highlight some of her accomplishments. Leeza is a New York-based interdisciplinary artist working in painting, installation, and public art and multiples. Born in the former Soviet Union, she immigrated to the United States with her family in 1989. She has created site-specific installations for the deCordova Sculpture Park and Museum in 2019 and 20, the Brooklyn Academy of Music in 1819, the National Academy of Design in 2018, the Uptown Triennial at the Lenfest Center for the Arts in 2017, the Utah Museum of Contemporary Art in 2016, and the Kitchen in New York in 2015. Trust me, there are many more, but that just gives you a highlight of the range of places she's done installation work. In 2015, she received the Emerging Artist Grant from the Rema Hort Mann Foundation, and in 2021, she was awarded the NYSCA NYFA Artist Fellowship in Interdisciplinary Work. In 2019, Meksin was the artist in residence at the Chinati Foundation in Marfa, Texas. Her work has been featured in The Bomb, The Brooklyn Rail, The New York Times, Hyperallergic, Chicago Tribune, and The Village Voice, among other publications. In 2013, Meksin co-founded the Ortega y Gasset Project in an artist-run gallery and curatorial collective in New York that she continues to co-direct. She received her MFA from Yale School of Art and a BFA from the School of Art Institute of Chicago and a BA/MA in Comparative Literature from the University of Chicago. From 2015 to 2021, Meksin taught at the Visual Arts program for Columbia University School of Art, where for 3 years she was the director of the graduate program, as well as the head of the new genre concentration. In 2021, she joined the faculty at Cornell University in the College of Architecture, Art, and Planning. Please help me welcome Leeza Meksin. Thank you, Leeza.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Kathy, and thank you for this invitation to speak. Thank you to all of you who are here. I'm so excited to see some familiar faces, some dating back to my high school experience. So that's such a treat. And also so nice to see some colleagues and some of my graduate students. I'm really honored to speak here tonight, and thank you all for being here. I'm going to start by kind of going back to some earlier works. Just going to maybe keep this one piece that I made at the beginning of grad school that kind of felt like a breakthrough for me at the time. And while it's on the screen, I'm going to talk a little bit about my background in the hopes that as different themes emerge, some connections could be made to where I come from and the experiences I've had, which I do think are typically part of the artist journey, processing one's experiences. So as Kathy mentioned, I was born in the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, in Moscow. My father's side of the family is from Ukraine, and my mother's side of the family is from Uzbekistan by way of Iran. So my parents met in Moscow when they were newly arrived there. My dad for a job and my mom to study at Moscow State University. So that's where I was born. And in '89, my family made the decision to immigrate from the Soviet Union. And that was a 5 months long process that took us through several countries in Europe. And we really didn't know where we were going to end up. And I was 12 at the time, or actually almost 12. But I kept saying to my parents that I'm 12 and I should have some rights. I was very, very upset. I did not want to leave, even though I understood my parents' reasons for wanting to do that. But I felt like, despite all the challenges that we faced, it was still our home and we had to kind of figure out a way to survive there. And I was also very, concerned about the evil capitalist West, which is what I knew of the West in my limited kind of communist brainwashing that definitely occurred during my early formative years. Also, I should mention that my family kind of has a history of multi-generational migration, evacuation, and immigration. So my own personal experience of immigration is mirrored in the histories of my parents, my grandparents, and my great-grandparents, and maybe beyond that as well, but kind of what I know of. So I think a lot about kind of the questions of assimilation and diaspora, home and belonging. What does it mean to be a native in a particular land? And what does it mean to be a constant foreigner in a particular land? So these are questions that kind of have informed my practice over the years. In college, I was really interested in languages and literature, poetry, and also costume design. So I did not study art in my college years, but I was making art. I was making oil paintings, portraits of my friends and family at the time. But I was really wrestling with kind of how to combine all these different interests into a coherent whole. And I think that's actually something that I continuously wrestle with. I don't think it has been resolved. But this painting felt like a stab in the right direction. I really was interested in wordplay and kind of nuances of language and language roots and what they might imply, and also how kind of formal compositional elements could focus in on certain meanings of a word or phrase. And this was also the first painting that combined spandex with oil painting. So this is oil on a panel with neon spandex stretched over it. In grad school, I continued to work with fabrics, thinking a lot about the body and kind of the implied, the immediate connection that we make to the body when we see fabric, the body in a domestic space, the private body. I was interested in connecting painting, the history of painting, to fabric, because on the one hand, there is such a live connection that is right in front of our eyes. Most paintings are on canvas or linen or other fabrics like burlap, but we kind of efface that knowledge and painting becomes something kind of harder and more rectilinear, right? Like the fluid parts of fabric are in a way erased or made less visible. So I was interested in kind of showing the stretchiness of fabric because I thought it corresponds to this idea that our bodies they don't have straight lines or right angles, and that they, have sometimes maybe issues with fitting in to certain structures like buildings or a painting. So this is kind of the beginning of me starting to think about how conventions of painting and conventions of architecture at times seem to be in direct contradiction to how our bodies feel to be in space. For my graduate thesis project, I did a installation that I called Fupa's Zangaveg, which at the time, this was like a word that was floating around, or two words rather, that were floating around the internet, and they caught my eyes because I'm really interested in language and neologisms and how kind of linguistics patterns are made and connotations that exist. So I knew that the way fupas were, as a word, as a concept, was used on the internet was pejorative. It stands for fat upper pussy area. And it was used in very pejorative ways. And I thought, but this could actually be a really great word. This could be a word that means something kind of, like chutzpah and pizzazz and kind of presence. So I wanted to reinvent the word, and I threw fupa making parties and invited everybody and provided materials and kind of wanted to play with this word. Then, I graduated, I was struggling to figure out the next steps, and I decided to make a multiples project that I called 100 pairs of spandex leggings. And this was the little flyer that I made to advertise the project. Basically, the way that it went, you contact me if you want to participate, and you give me a word, and based on that word, I choose a pattern in spandex and make a pair of leggings for you and send it to you. And in exchange, I asked participants to send me a picture of themselves wearing their leggings. So here's some participants showing off their leggings. I think the word here was potato, and here it was crush. And then, I'm kind of jumping ahead. This is a project that I did several years later with the negative shape that I had from making all of the leggings. So the leggings, I used a pattern to make them. And the part that was the negative shape of the crotch had this shape that you see in front of you repeated. Maybe it's the immigrant in me, but I can never let go of materials, and I kind of hoard materials and scraps. And so I knew that I really liked the shape, but I wasn't sure why or how to use it. And then years later, I put together a show that I called Negative Crotch and Other Friends. And so this was one of the pieces in that show. So kind of the themes that I'm still playing with here and that continue in my work are how humor maybe relates to the body and creates like a destabilizing element that helps us navigate our, at times, dissociative relationship to spaces such as white cubes or other architectural spaces that feel actually kind of foreign and oppressive. This was another early installation. This one I called Douchebags. So I made all of these bags that had boobs and other kind of body parts. I made them out of neoprene. This was sort of the beginning of my interest in this material, neoprene, which you'll see come up later as well. It's a kind of fleshy, spongy material that very much kind of mimics skin and is used in a lot of shapewear. So it kind of has this very gendered life. So I looked at a lot of designer handbags and kind of freestyled riffing on their forms, remaking them in these neoprene fabrics, and thinking a lot about, what does it mean for a handbag to cost so much money and to need its own seat at times, and how sometimes paintings or other art objects kind of mirror that relationship of commodity and luxury object. So kind of trying to challenge that in a way, but also think about display culture and how things are organized in stores. This is a project called House Code that I did in 2011 in St. Louis. And it was the first large scale all building wrap. I thought of it as, and I still, I guess, think of all of my architectural interventions as architectural drags. So I think of it as outfits for buildings that kind of aim to shift the seriousness of architecture and play with the notions of hard and soft, public and private, kind of civic and domestic. So House Code was a title that I kind of tried to create a bit of a pun that it's, it's literally sort of this code for a house, but it's also something that feels like maybe it should be on the inside. And it was thinking about issues of gentrifications and whitewashing. It was in a community that was sort of rapidly being gentrified, but still had a lot of boarded up houses around it. For this particular project, I actually printed the pattern of these gold linked chains. Usually there's really no need to print your own spandex because it comes in every pattern imaginable. But when you're going large, kind of on the architectural scale, it does become more important because most fabric is printed to the body scale. So when you put it on such a large surface, it optically mixes and kind of becomes invisible as a pattern. So I wanted to print a really large, kind of oversized pattern that would be visible and kind of would belong in terms of its scale to the structure. So a lot of the logic that I was using in this project had to do with like, well, how do we wear clothes on our bodies? We don't nail clothes onto ourselves, for example. So I did not want to do any kind of intrusive nailing or making of holes. So everything is either corseted or kind of held in place by buttons or weights or bungee cords. So now I'm going to kind of jump forward by about a decade and talk about a more recent project that I did at the deCordova Sculpture Park and Museum. So this is the building that houses the museum. And as you could see, it's a kind of mishmash of architectural styles. My grandfather was an architect. So I was, from a very early age, I was made aware of the character different buildings have and different materials that are used architecturally. I didn't ever really think that it would make its way into my work. But when I started to work with fabric in grad school, a professor once told me that for a woman working with fabric, it's a bit of a career suicide. And I was really struck by that because, gratefully, I don't think that that is necessarily the case anymore. But when I was in grad school, that maybe was still a prevalent attitude. And I thought a lot about like, what is it that makes fabric so kind of expected for a woman to use, and how could we reconstruct this kind of identity of fabric as being connected to things that are sort of not thought of as high art. And I'm very interested in design and craft. So I wanted to kind of challenge that paradigm. And I thought scale might be the way to rethink it. So that's kind of how I started to arrive at outfits for architecture. So when I get invited to do a project, a site-specific project, I go to the site and I explore it. I look at images of it. I do some research, and then I start to kind of arrive at a plan of what I want to do. So I was really interested in the turrets, the turret tops that you see, the kind of the repeating shape atop of these towers. I thought about how, the doubling of the shape kind of immediately reminds me of the body, because so much in our bodies is symmetrical. And it makes me think of breasts and skirts, but also of tents. And I was very surprised to find out that they're actually quite big. They, when you're on the ground looking up, they seem very dainty and decorative. But when we measured them, they were quite large, over 20 feet in diameter and over 20 feet in height, but they were completely dead space. So they were never used, meaning like the towers were used. And here's some images of how the interior of the towers were used by the deCordovas before it became a museum. But the turret tops themselves were dead space. And so I thought that was very interesting And I couldn't help but feel that that cannot be accidental, because this sort of most feminine aspect architecturally of this building was rendered useless through the fact that you couldn't actually use the space. It was purely decorative. So I thought, what would happen if I were to kind of behead the towers and put the turret tops on the ground of the park and make them enterable, so kind of make them more like tents, but keep their shape and their scale. So here's some, this is like, I was working with a 1-inch scale model to kind of think through how these objects would function on the ground of the museum. I knew that I wanted them to be both body and dwelling. So I was really interested in this idea that they evoke breasts and, maybe even wombs, because they're enterable, but they're also very much like tents or yurts or teepees. And so I wanted the layering to kind of reflect that. So there is a layer of neoprene that sort of stands in for skin or flesh. And then there's a layer of this fabric called glide skin, which I thought of as the garment. Part of the preparation for this was also weathering a bunch of neoprene and glide skin on my fire escape in New York City. I made a series of paintings that were basically sun-bleached neoprene. So these paintings, the one on the left was a 3 months exposure. The one on the right was only a month, but they were in different kind of sun situations. Here's 2 more examples. So then here are the turrets in the park. This is when they were just first installed. And so you could see kind of, one is this plum color and one is a pink color with this kind of golden glide skin as a garment, 2 different kinds of garments on top. And here's shots of the interiors of the 2. So the interiors were very much kind of bathed in this very warm color light, and there was a very pleasant place to be inside of them. One of the things that I was really interested in is their kind of the temporal quality of their life in the park. So I knew that they're gonna be in this park in Massachusetts for a little bit over a year, and that they need to weather the elements. They need to weather, the harsh winter, but also the glaring sun, which is actually worse for rubber-based fabrics because it destroys those follicles. So I thought a lot about how kind of inappropriate it is to put these materials in a sculpture garden where people typically see hardier materials such as marble and granite and bronze, materials that are sort of meant to be left outdoors and are meant to last, that they're sort of for posterity. So I've been thinking a lot about what does that mean and why do we make things for posterity? And what does it mean to encounter something that's aging, like an art piece that's aging inappropriately? So here's some images of the turrets surviving the winter. And I would, all throughout the year, I would kind of wake up in a cold sweat and be like, oh, there's a storm coming, and they're all, and it was, of course, the pandemic hit, so I couldn't even go to visit them. So I really felt worried about them. Here they are in the spring, where you could already see that they've weathered quite a bit, and there, you could see the sun bleaching occurring. Here is the kind of weathering that happened on the glide skin. So I was really interested in these kind of unsightly marks and like the idea that we typically don't see these materials in a sculpture park, and there's a kind of good reason for that. But I wanted to maybe challenge that a little bit and think about what it reflects back to us about ourselves, that we'd rather see hardy materials that do last, that kind of give us a sense of timelessness or immortality. And so about a year after they were installed, their garments were removed, and they spent the last couple of months of their life in the park naked with these sun-bleached patterns on them. So you know, the relationship to painting was very important to me in this project, that the painting was sort of made by the elements in collaboration with me, or I worked in collaboration with the elements to create these images. Now I'll talk briefly about another project in which I tried to reflect back on the architecture that I was inhabiting. This was at Chinati in Marfa, Texas, where I did a 2 months long residency. This was an old meat locker. And as soon as I got there, I was really struck by all of the doors. So there were many very weird doors, like over a dozen of doors of all different kinds, thick and thin and squat and tall and double doors and doors with windows. At the same time, I was reading about the ancient Egyptian concept of false doors. And false doors were these relief or painted doors in temples and tombs that were meant for the soul. So the ancient Egyptians believed that if our body needs a passageway, such as a door to enter from the outside to the inside and vice versa, then our soul needs something similar. So I thought it was, you know, quite an interesting and serendipitous coincidence that I was reading about false doors while in a place that had so many strange doors that kind of talk to the building's history. And I decided to kind of make portraits of the doors out of fabric. So kind of using their scale and general structure to create these fabric paintings that I would make on the floor, organizing the composition, and then I would stiffen them. So you could still see that it's fabric, but it does have this kind of in-between quality. It's not quite as hard and straight as a door, but it's not as flowy and loose as fabric either. And I placed these false doors either kind of in direct relationship to the doors in the space. So you sort of had an embodied connection to their scale. Also, I was very interested in what I was learning about the 18th dynasty pharaoh, female pharaoh, Hatshepsut, who continues to fascinate me. She was sort of the prototype of a cross-dresser or gender-bending person who, as she took power and she ruled Egypt for about 20 years, during her reign, she was able to construct really monumental structures, some of the most famous ancient Egyptian structures that we know of. Oops, I think there it is. So this is her mortuary temple, which was actually for thousands of years attributed to either her father, Thutmose I, or her stepson, Thutmose III, because she was actually erased, like literally chiseled out of the historical record after she passed. And there is some, extrapolation on why she was chiseled out. And I want to guess that it had something to do with the fact that she really strained the order of things by announcing herself to be a pharaoh and by putting on the false beard that all Egyptian pharaohs wore. So that kind of really, didn't sit well with the priests and with her successor. So she, her mortuary temple and all of this amazing statuary artworks of her were hauled out of the temple and thrown into this nearby quarry, a very deep hole, that way kind of erasing her. But about 3,000 years later, the hole was discovered by an archaeological team, and miraculously all the pieces were in the same place because they were just dumped there. So that place became known as Hatshepsut's hole, Hole, which as a concept I was really interested in as a both kind of metaphor for how female bodied people have been treated historically, but also kind of our maybe attitude towards the earth and kind of treating the world around us in that kind of violent way. So I made a series of works that sort of played with this idea of Hatshepsut's hole and silencing and throwing things into the bottom of the ocean, but that they're still there. They don't evaporate. And that led me to thinking about some other tropes of ancient architecture, such as the columns, specifically Ionic columns, because I was really interested how the parts, the decorative parts at the top looked like eyes and ovaries and breasts, and kind of made the whole column feel like a figure. So I started making a series of oil stick drawings that kind of played with this idea that columns are usually support structures and are sturdy and made out of hard materials, but in my drawings they kind of waver and make way for these kind of playful references to feminine spaces. And those drawings led to this site-specific installation I did this past summer in Brooklyn at this site called Clear Sky. So this is a painting that I made on site with dye and permanent marker on neoprene. Here are some details. And I'm pretty much out of time, so I want to. I'm just going to run through some of these images. This is from BAM. My installation there was called Hoist Store Shed, and it involved 8 tapestries that used non-traditional mediums such as rubber and silicone, combined with acrylic paint and these spandex all body suits. And very quickly, just some paintings. This was a series of pregnant paintings that I made. And these are all kind of body scaled. And a lot of my paintings use non-traditional materials and kind of juxtapose them with the more traditional. So here we see like upholstery tacks and spandex printed fur or fur printed spandex, and a hairnet, but also oil paint and canvas and linen. I knew that I put in too many images, not enough time to speak, but I think I'd love to just open it up to questions.
Well, while you're thinking of your question, I guess I do. Thank you. That was a really wonderful overview of all your work. And I'm so struck by the tension between the painterly approach of your use of fabric, particularly in the sort of flat pieces, but the obvious attention to the embodiment and texture and feel. And I think you must have just a natural sense and attraction to fabric itself, and the way it sort of has become sort of the soul of your work. I wondered if you could just talk about that a little bit more.
Thank you, Kathy. Yeah, that's a really meaningful question for me. So I'm grateful for you bringing it up. There is an artwork in our Moscow apartment that I always think back to when I try to understand, like, when did my interest in fabric really begin? And we, my grandfather, as I mentioned, was an architect, and we lived together with my grandparents in this 3-room flat. And there was, lots of art by his friends. Most of it was representational and, drawings and paintings. But then there was this one collage made out of wrinkled silk, and it was a still life. It was a vase with flowers, and it was barely representational. It was, it kind of teetered between being a vase with flowers and just being an abstract collage or painting. And I just used to stare at it and really love it. And I'm still heartbroken that we couldn't leave with it. We couldn't leave with any of our stuff. So I think back to that. I also think back to the fact that, I had no idea that in my ancestry, there are, on both sides of my family, there are people who were fabric designers. So, when I found that out, I was really struck by that. And I do think a lot about kind of intergenerational inheritance and this kind of like ephemeral things that run through families, including trauma. So I think about how, like, the comforting aspects of fabric, the fact that it connects us to home, to family, to ethnic identity, right? Like my family from Uzbekistan, their fabrics were markedly different than my family from the Ukraine, but they both had such vivid identities. So I came to really value how they sort of speak in these abstract languages that are very hard to put into words, and in a way are pre-verbal. They kind of say things to us and make us feel in certain ways that cannot be distilled to language, or at least when I try, it falls flat. So I think that dimension of fabric really captures me. And then, of course, how it relates to the history of painting is also very interesting to me, both in the sense of the relationship of fabric to painting support, but also how often we see patterns and fabrics described through paint. And there is such a kind of satisfying aspect to seeing a particular fabric come to life, especially like in oil paint.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so interesting. And I like the identity through the different kind of representation of fabric, but your language around that, identifying it as being pre-verbal, I think is in your work even more so, because there is this sort of presence of the body, particularly with that neoprene and the stretchy fabric, and it's so connected to undergarments. And yeah, I really and comfort too, because it all feels sort of soft and shapely. Yeah, it's really lovely. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy.
Hi, Lisa. I'm Diana. I have a question. In the sculptures at the park, did you intend it for the entrances of them to be right in front of each other? Was that intentionally?
Yeah, so they are spaced exactly, the same distance apart as they are up on the building. But again, because, the building is tall, it feels like they're much closer together. But when you're actually with them on the ground, it was, we measured it and it's like, yep, this is the distance between them. And we sort of made a walkway between them, and the entrances are pointing towards each other to kind of make them a pair, right? That they're there together. I really didn't want to make a single turret, which was kind of looming large over me because due to funding issues and concerns, that was a real possibility. And I just felt like, no, if it's a single turret, it becomes an icon, it becomes a singularity. And for me, it was really about the pair of them being there together, kind of not touching, but holding each other in their entrance eye, the eye being the entrance.
Yeah, I think it works beautifully how those pictures, like you're like in the inside and you just see the entrance of the other sculpture. I think it really works beautifully. Thank you.
Thank you for your question, Deanna.
So I have a couple questions in the chat. First, Joanne asks, she says, your work is compelling and beautiful. You spoke of questioning the impermanence of materials. As a former archival picture framer, I'm interested in how artists feel about this. Can you talk a little bit more about it?
Yeah, that's such a great question, and I think about it all the time. And I feel that tension a lot. Part of me feels like preservation and archival qualities of art is not my concern. Because I feel like I want to be in the present moment. I want to interact with materials. I want them to reflect something about the now and interact with the people that are living right now. But on the other hand, I'm so moved by, for example, Hatshepsut's story, and if she didn't have her statuary works made out of granite and marble, 3,000 years later, they wouldn't have been discovered in this quarry. And so I think about that, right? The kind of tension that's there, that there is this sort of value, this implicit value for materials lasting because they give us this rich story, or give us a glimpse into something that we cannot experience in our lifetime directly. So I'm really interested in that, but I also think that our kind of like the way that arts history, at least the history of Western art, has become so obsessed with materials that last and are sort of exalted through their expensive and lasting qualities. And I think that inadvertently sends the signal that there's something wrong with our bodies and with the fact that we age and we die. So I think for me, I mean, maybe this is like the morbid Russian part, but a lot of things kind of come back to mortality and the fact that art is a mediation of that space of kind of thinking about our moment here and processing that and communing about it with other people. And I do really value the idea of communion through time. So like, I feel like when I was really obsessed with Hatshepsut, I mean, I'm still obsessed with Hatshepsut, but when I was reading a lot about Hatshepsut and looking at images of her statues, and painting her portrait, I felt like I was communing with her. And so I wouldn't be able to have that if if some of these objects weren't made to last. So I think this tension is really interesting. But in the contemporary moment, I think I'm more interested in questioning why are we so obsessed with making things for posterity at the expense of our own kind of well-being and our reality, right? That there's a certain reality that we wish to avoid or like not look directly at.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, thank you for that. I have another question from the chat. Your process for testing prior to the large site-specific installation seems to become essential to the piece itself. That's a question. How do you evaluate the different testing that might be needed for a project? For instance, testing for the turret tops.
I think process is kind of the most interesting part for me. And I think part of the reason I like working site specifically is because so many things come up that you can't plan for. And there's like an element of losing control and having to improvise and having to kind of let that stress in. And I think it does sort of relate to my experience of immigration and having to pack up and leave a bunch of things behind and make these hard decisions about what stays and what goes, and then assimilating to a new place and kind of trying to answer all those questions. So I think the working site specifically kind of mirrors that experience, for better or for worse. I mean, it's always very stressful. So I'm always like, why am I doing this to myself? But then it kind of brings me back to some of these, or maybe it activates a part of my brain that when I'm just alone in my studio working on my paintings is not as active, this kind of fight or flight instinct. But going back to the question regarding the process, I think I'm really, I like to set up situations in which the process will surprise me. So I think that element is the one that I kind of seek the most. If things are all kind of answered ahead of time, there's not really a good reason to keep going. And a lot of my projects kind of don't get realized because I feel like I reach a certain place with them where I'm like, oh, I kind of know how it's going to be. So like even with my installations, I never kind of do the same thing. It has to have a new element for me to kind of discover and play with. And then, things like doing the paintings on the fire escape, it kind of gives me a little bit of knowledge about what to expect. But then once you go at that large scale, things really change. There's a lot of unpredictable factors. And that's both, really kind of scary, but also very exciting for me.
Yeah, that sounds like a little bit of risk taking there, but also I think motivation to actually make the work, the two of them. Well, maybe I'll follow up with another kind of technical. I was looking at the turrets and thinking that there were different kinds of, there were a lot of different kinds of technical things that had to do with building the turret itself, but also with just particularly with the fabric and the sewing. Like there was a sewing that was the construction of the piece, but then there was the sort of knitting or lacing pieces of it. And it seemed to have a nice mix or a mix of sewing that's meant to be to a purpose in the end, and other kind of sewing or knitting that was decorative or held a different kind of meaning. I don't know if you want to talk about technical questions and your relationship to the technical aspect of making the larger work that's not there in the smaller pieces.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm really, I'm always interested in craft, but I also find my place with it for reasons that are maybe outside of my control. Like for example, I'm not a patient person. I'm not someone who could sit there and embroider something for hours, but I really like looking at embroidery. I really like thinking about how the time spent with an object translates to a certain kind of energy that emanates from it. But I also think that when things are done with a kind of, there's an energy that comes through attacking material without the finesse of craft. And I think that energy speaks to like a very emotional, maybe even traumatized place. And a lot of times when things are not finessed, for me, when I look at art, that's when I really start to feel a tension. And so I think a lot of times I kind of fight when I get good at a certain process, like I was using corsetting, and then, I got good at corsetting and it became a little too perfect. And so I stopped using corsetting because it ceased to speak to kind of like Frankenstein joining of disparate things together. And I really like it when things look like they're struggling to be together, that it's not this seamless and kind of well orchestrated meeting, that there is tension.
Thank you so much for your talk, Leeza. That was really amazing.
Thank you. I'm just going to walk and plug my computer in because I got a warning message that it's going to die. Speaking of mortality. But go ahead, Kelsey, please ask your question. So nice to see you, by the way.
Yeah, likewise. So I was thinking, especially with your turret pieces, about this kind of how you're fulfilling the desires of people to kind of embody this architecture that we could never be inside, right? So like taking off the turrets from the towers and we can actually enter them and walk inside of them. And then I was thinking about how you kind of made an inverse of that with the false doors at the show. So you're almost like with those creating an architectural space that maybe you want to go through, but it's impossible to actually use the space. So I'm just wondering, just quickly, if you approach those kinds of projects in different ways when you know that you want the viewer to kind of embody a space, or you know that the viewer won't be able to collaborate with it in the same way.
That's really beautiful and thoughtful. Thank you. Yeah, I wouldn't say like I go into a project constructing those relationships, but I love what you pointed out, especially about this kind of the difference in the false doors project and the enterable turrets. I think that the connection for me is drawing attention to how our bodies feel in space, right? I think sometimes we are, or maybe I'll just speak for myself, like I didn't know how oppressed I was by architecture until I was in a cave once, so there is a kind of embodied experience that comes from being in places that we know deep inside, but we are sort of trained out of feeling or acknowledging it, because so much of the spaces that we occupy are kind of have this like brutalist, even when they're not brutalist buildings, quality in relationship to the body. So and I think about how fabric is a way to kind of mediate that space, and it's like a little bit of softness and humanity. And this is, I'm not trying to denigrate architecture. I'm really interested in architecture, but I do think that there is a lot of tension between how we live in our bodies and how we live in our dwellings, and what kind of our dwellings say to us about our values as a society. So, the fact that rectilinear architecture really didn't exist for a lot of human history, and what started to happen when that's how we build our buildings. So I think creating spaces in which, creating spaces in which I could set up that relationship with a viewer, where there's a kind of tacit implication of the space, right, through the scale of a door and the shape of a door, but then something's different about this door. So you kind of see the two in contrast to each other, and that starts to maybe speak to how we occupy space. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Leeza, thank you so much. You've been so generous with your time, and it's really been lovely to walk through your work and hear you talk about it. So thank you so much for participating. I hope we can have you here in person at the Vermont Studio Center sometime in the future. And to everyone else, I want to thank you for joining us tonight. And I want to invite you to check out our other events online. Our next event is on Monday, and it's Right Around the Rise, Paige Buffington, and there are some really wonderful readings as well, and another artist talk next month. So please keep your eye on our events page. Thank you so much, Leeza. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Kathy, for inviting me, and thank you to all of you for being here and for asking such great questions. It means a lot.
Thanks. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Have
you.
a great night.
Bye.
Bye.